ensure that we can share this.
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it. This will ensure that we can share this online after the event. So thanks everybody again for coming. My name is Pete Harrison. I'm the director of Desegregate Connecticut, and along with Abundant Housing Massachusetts, People's Alliance Maine, we are happy to have our discussion this evening about our pro-homes victories in the last year or so across New England, and talking to some of the authors of that success so far. And we'll get a chance to talk about what has worked, what's coming up, and what we can all do to learn from each other and make sure that each of our states and our region overall is more affordable, accessible, and sustainable for all. I'm going to get started quickly, and we'll basically run through very quick introductions from each organization. I'll let Kate and Cassie introduce themselves shortly, and then we will have Kate conduct a panel discussion with our three panelists from each state. Then we will also have a audience question and answer period after that for the last 20 minutes or so. I do encourage folks that have questions to please share them in the chat. We will make sure to log those questions and get to them at the audience section. So if anyone has a question during the panel discussion, please do feel free to message that in the chat, and we'll make sure to take care of that. All right, so I will just get started very quickly with a quick background of some stuff in Connecticut. And actually, sorry, let me share my screen. All right.
Pete, you're on mute.
Try that again. Share screen, not the audio. All right. All right, so can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, sorry about that. It never fails 2 years into this. So as I said, for those who missed you, apologize. I will let Kate and Cassie introduce themselves and what's going on in Maine and Massachusetts respectively. But I'll just give quickly a background of some of the exciting stuff that's happened in Connecticut. Just last year, we were able to pass Public Act 2129, which is the first zoning reform act in about 30 years in Connecticut. Just quickly to go over what it was, highlighting a few things. One, it enshrined further affirming housing and zoning. It allowed ADUs across the state as of right, and also capped parking requirements. There were opt-out provisions for towns to do that. Wasn't as bad as we feared, wasn't as good as we hoped, as I'm sure we'll talk about. It also importantly defined what character means in the context of zoning to make sure folks can use that as an excuse to kill projects. It requires training for local planning and zoning boards. And it also set up some working groups to explore different types of zoning, including like form-based zones and other types of things. So we're really proud that that got passed, very much with the help of Kristen McCarthy-Vahey, who's on the call with us, who will also talk about what we're working on next, including our big transit-oriented community bill that was raised this year that we look forward to getting done next year. So just quickly to introduce Rep. McCarthy-Vahey. State Representative Kristen McCarthy-Vahey is serving her 4th term representing Fairfield's 133rd district, which is in Fairfield County. She's the House Chair of the Planning and Development Committee and a member of the Government Administration and Elections Transportation Committee. In Kristen's role as Planning and Development and Committee Chair, she has been integral to modernizing and reorganizing zoning statutes to provide greater clarity and tools for local planning and zoning officials, to empower towns and cities to facilitate economic growth, and to ensure inclusive communities, add energy and environmental protections at the local level, and to make sure that particularly accessory dwelling units and the parking caps were passed in this past year. So we're really excited and grateful for Representative McCarthy-Vahey's championing our cause in Connecticut. We look forward to hearing about her experiences in the trenches, getting this work through and what's coming up next. And I'll turn it over to Kate to talk about Maine.
Thanks, Pete, so much. So, hi, everybody. My name is Kate Blackford. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Maine People's Alliance. And just really quickly, with me today is State Representative Tracy Geer, who has just served her first term in the Maine State House, where she is a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Labor and Housing. And Representative Gear is going to tell us a whole lot more about sort of how things went down this year and last year. But she has spent previously over 30 years in research and marketing in the high tech and consumer goods industry, and most recently owned a retail store focusing on creativity and STEM education and the work of many Maine makers. And she has an incredibly strong commitment to education, sustainable economic development, and community building. She was a huge champion for making sure that both affordable housing priorities as well as zoning reforms made it through the legislature this year. And just a little bit of background about sort of what did make it through and what we're going to talk about tonight. Maine, like most places, is in the midst of a housing crisis. We're expecting to see some of the highest price inflation in rates in the country this year. But as a state, we also very much need to attract more people, especially young people, to grow our workforce. And with housing prices this high, it's really easy to feel like we have nothing to share with people who are from away. There were a number of housing reforms and projects that passed this year, but the one we're going to talk about tonight was zoning reforms that recently made headlines. It was Bill LD 2003, and we're hoping that it can help address the sense of scarcity and set us on a path to a future with greater opportunities. It really came out of a 2001 commission that the legislature created to explore opportunities to increase housing in Maine by reforming zoning and land use laws. We heard from experts all across the country, including Desegregate Connecticut, and they developed 9 recommendations. That legislation brought forward those recommendations for implementation, and the commission process really helped build up public support for those policies, but they still face some pretty vehement opposition, which I'm sure we'll hear from tonight, more about tonight, from local officials across the state who are really afraid about losing local control. And so in the end, we still passed 5 modified reforms, which are significant changes. So we also now have accessory dwelling units by right in all single family zoning. You can have up to 4 residential units on a vacant lot that has public water and sewer, as long as it meets other zoning and land use requirements. We have a technical assistance program that's a competitive grant program now for communities seeking to increase housing opportunities by looking at their zoning. And then there's also density bonuses for residential zones that already allow multifamily housing. And so it's a 2.5 times the density and a strongly reduced parking requirement in those zones if you're building affordable housing. And then we took Connecticut's language to require local zoning ordinances to affirmatively further fair housing. So hopefully these policies come together to address the fact that we're underbuilt and recognize too that this really is a statewide problem and every community has a role to play in addressing our housing needs.
All right, thank you, Kate. And I'll turn over to Cassie to give us the lowdown in Massachusetts.
Great. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Cassie Infante, and I am the statewide organizer at Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. Really excited to see a number of our members here. If you're new to AMA, we are a statewide coalition made up of over 300 individual and coalition members across the state, and we stand up for abundant housing for all. We do that by driving policy at the state and local level, so really building capacity of local organizers to engage in municipal policy change, but also connecting, a statewide network to advocacy opportunities at the State House. Massachusetts is the 3rd most expensive state in the country for housing, but we know that through action and organizing and our areas of focus, which are production, desegregation and zoning reform, and tenant protections, we can really work to change that. One thing, one huge win that happened this year is the MBTA communities law, and it's really about working towards transit-oriented development. So this law was passed last session in the legislature and Governor Baker signed it into law. It's the most comprehensive zoning reform in a generation. And it's going to make it easier for communities to embrace smart growth solutions to really help alleviate our statewide housing shortage. And so what this law does is that it mandates 175 communities serviced by the MBTA, which you can see here on the screen, are the communities in green. It mandates that they have at least one zone where multifamily housing is allowed by right. If applicable, the district needs to be within 1/2 mile of a transit station. And cities and towns also have the option to spread the required multifamily district across multiple locations at varying densities. So that not only encourages new housing near transit, but also aligns with the existing commercial corridors and town or village centers. So I know we'll hear more tonight about what are the challenges and sort of where we're going next in our advocacy for MBTA community law implementation. But for now, I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker this evening from Massachusetts. Mallory Strain is legislative aide to Representative Andy Vargas, who represents the 3rd Essex District and is from my hometown of Haverhill, Mass. So I'm really excited to have Mallory here. Team Vargas has really been co-conspirators for Abundant Housing Massachusetts and our fight for housing. And Representative Vargas is also the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Economic Development and Emerging Technologies. What's really important to note here is that Team Vargas, alongside Representative Honan and Senator Crichton, really champions the MBTA law, knowing how vital housing is for the health and future of the Commonwealth. And Representative Vargas is also the lead sponsor of House Bill 1448, which I think is really important to mention. It's a landmark bill that would expand multifamily zoning across the state, legalize ADUs by right, and set housing production and affordability requirements, the last of which we've never seen in Massachusetts. So we're really excited about that coming next. I will, at this point, turn things back over to Kate for our panel.
Thanks so much, Cassie. I'm wondering, does it make sense for us to just, can we spotlight our panelists so that they're front and center for folks when they're speaking? I don't know if that's possible with the screen sharing.
Yeah, I'm
I can always
trying to
I
spotlight
can stop
everyone.
screen
Let's
sharing
see.
soon after.
Just want to make sure folks get a chance to see them when they're speaking. All right, well, all 3 of you have been hugely involved and a big part of the big and small changes that are happening in your states. So I would love to hear from each of you. What does it mean to win on housing? And I will start with my own Representative Tracy Geer. What does it mean to win on housing?
Thanks so much, Kate. It was a very interesting question and a really interesting way, I thought, to start off this discussion today, because, it's very hard, I think, to know when you've won if you don't have a clear definition of what that is. And so in thinking about that particular question, for me, it's around 3 things. And those things are buy-in, builders, and basics. So for me, a big part of having success in the housing area has to do with buy-in. So, and Kate, I know, has heard me say this on Labor and Housing Committee meetings quite a bit, but the thing that we need in Maine, and I don't think we're that different than other states, is that we need housing for everyone. I characterize our housing market as incredibly clogged. We have people that stay in their homes for decades in Maine and do not move and do not change those residences. And increasingly, they have been unable to, because people that would have otherwise moved out of a rental property into a home they own have been unable to do so, simply because homes for ownership are so expensive. So they are staying there. That means those rental units do not become available for others to move into. And the clog just continues to grow and grow. So I call housing in committee, I call it regular people housing. This is housing for everyone, from someone who is just starting out in their career and has a entry-level job and isn't making much money, to someone who is simply struggling to afford a place to live at all, to someone who is perhaps a certified nursing assistant or a teacher or a public safety worker. And again, who's not making a ton of money and really just cannot find any place that's affordable to live. So the first is the buy-in. The second is builders. So this is where we just don't have enough people to build houses. And I think we're going to touch on this when we talk about the public and the private sector challenges there. But the challenge is really having enough folks who have the ability to be developers and to build, and then also have the wherewithal to, and the knowledge to put together the financing packages, to work with communities on the very complicated zoning that many communities have ended up with in order to make projects happen. And the third is what I call basics. So this is where I touched on the issue of complexity, where we've got a lot of really, really hard paperwork and different programs that folks need to work with, for example, to do a LIHTC project. And that is prohibitive for many developers. So it does stop people from getting in there. So those are the three things that I think if we were to have success in each of those areas would be foundational for then helping us to spur on more success in basically, back to the start there, building more homes of all different types for all different kinds of folks.
Thank you. Representative McCarthy-Vahey, what would you say success in housing or winning in housing looks like?
Well, thank you. I like the word success more than winning, because sometimes when we talk about winning, there's this idea that there are winners and losers. And I think success is that people at all income levels have affordable places to live. When we look at it in terms of legislation, I think that, it's making progress towards those goals. A lot of times we want to be able to get a lot further along than we can. But I think there's a piece of education that happens. And for example, in Connecticut, we have, as I said, the Planning and Development Committee, which is the committee that I co-chair. We have a separate housing committee, which at one point in time was part of that Planning and Development Committee. And I find that even as legislators, because sometimes we're working in those siloed places, we don't always understand the full impact or all the different pieces and programs when it comes to housing. So in planning and development, we've been a lot more in the planning side and the zoning side of things. But I think the success is that when we are beginning to help people first understand the scope of the problem and be able to define the problem and to agree on the problem. And I think that's one of the challenges that we've had that we may talk about, so that we can come up with solutions that work. And I love the things that Rep. Gear had to say in terms of getting the buy-in. And that's certainly been a challenge for us. But as we hear more, for example, here in Fairfield, from our senior citizens who are looking to have a different kind of housing than they've lived in, for example, who may need to downsize because they're now on a fixed income, it's really broadening the conversation as we're hearing more from our business community about what the need is there and how the lack of housing, which what a theme I'm hearing, right? Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, we're hearing this all over the country, what's happening in terms of housing right now, particularly in these high price markets such as Fairfield County, Connecticut is. So I think success is to build the foundation, but also to be looking, and that no pun intended on that, but also to be looking at what's sustainable for the long term. So really to be thinking about things in terms of what can communities sustain, and what we can do in the short term sometimes isn't always the best for the long term.
That's very true. Thank you. Mallory, what would you add, or what would you say is different in terms of the way that you think about either winning or success on housing?
Yeah, it's been really exciting to see the progress that Massachusetts made on housing. From a legislative perspective, I think it's really difficult to be a legislative aide that works in Massachusetts and not care about housing. Particularly Eastern Massachusetts. I say this all the time, but there's not a week that goes by where our office doesn't hear from a constituent that's in a housing crisis. And that's across the board. A lot of the time it's people who are disabled, or it's people who are, it's elderly people, it's people with kids. So it's just really hard to be in that position and not want to see change. So it's really exciting to see the progress that's been made, and it's just been a massive success in moving forward the MBTA communities law. And And, from a personal perspective, I'm a renter. I live in Boston, and Boston's one of the most expensive places to live in the country. And you can really feel the shortage and the rise in costs. So seeing the passage of this bill, and now that we're in the implementation stage, it's exciting because there will be more homes in Massachusetts. There will be more production, and we will see more places to live for people in the coming years. And that's really exciting and animating. And there's a long way to go, and there's a lot more to do, but this is a massive first step in that direction.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing both the urgency as well as the excitement that's happening right now. So one of the things that I think is really interesting is there's having worked in affordable housing for an incredibly long time now, the amount of attention that this gets, whereas it felt a long time ago like we were just sort of banging our fists on the door and nobody wanted to talk about housing. It's really exciting to see that there's a lot of buy-in to the idea that it needs to be addressed, but there's also a lot of difference about what it means to address housing. And generally, while there's more and more bipartisan support, there's typically strong Democratic support in theory. And then when you get down into the details, sometimes it can be really, really challenging to get something through. And so I was wondering if you could all talk a little bit about sort of what opposition has zoning and housing really faced, both in general in your state, sort of what are the forces that tend to oppose these kinds of reforms, as well as particularly from within the Democratic Party, or sort of intra-party differences around how you approach the housing crisis. And I'll go in opposite order. Mallory, why don't we start with you?
So our office is heavily focused on zoning reform. We look at housing from a lot of different perspectives, but that's something that we've been working on really closely this session. And there are heavily Democrat towns in Massachusetts that aren't necessarily friendly to housing development. Regardless of party, there are people that don't really like to see housing development pop up in their neighborhoods. And so there's sometimes kind of a cognitive dissonance in terms of individuals caring about housing genuinely and caring about people having affordable access to housing, but then being concerned about or kind of resistant to zoning reform that would allow homes to be built in their own communities. And that continues to be a problem even in solidly blue towns and districts. And on the other hand, there are towns like Haverhill, or cities like Haverhill, which is a much more purple district. Haverhill is my boss's district, but even though Haverhill is much more purple, Haverhill has been kind of leading the way in terms of housing production, particularly in MBTA communities. So they've been really friendly to creating more housing, despite being less blue than other towns that might not necessarily be friendly to housing development. So I don't think it's always necessarily a red versus blue, at least from our perspective. And in terms of kind of within the Democratic Party, sometimes there are pro-housing, or there are pro-housing individuals and pro-affordable housing individuals that might see development come up in their community. And maybe this development is an affordable housing development, but it doesn't necessarily look like it would be affordable because it's brand new and it looks like it's this kind of shiny new building. So on its face, it doesn't necessarily look like it's affordable. So people feel that it's gentrification. So there can be resistance in those ways. And there are also people, typically more progressive individuals, who have concerns about market rate housing because they want there to be more affordable housing, which is there absolutely 100% needs to be more affordable housing. But we also need more market rate housing because we need a diverse mix of housing in general to address the rising costs and the shortage overall. So that's what we see, at least over the past couple of years while we've been working on zoning reform.
That sounds really similar to some of what we're seeing here in Maine, in terms of that it's not really, there's some bit of partisanship to it in terms of Dems tend to be more supportive of some of the reforms than some of the Republicans, but it really does oftentimes seem to come down to sort of who people represent and what the community consensus is on sort of what kind of housing should be there. Representative Gear, you represent a very wealthy coastal town, and that has manifested in really interesting ways. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the opposition and support in Kennebunk and the sort of in York County has been to housing reforms?
This is something that is, sometimes you feel like you're through the wormhole on some of it because, and I'm guessing that Representative McCarthy-Vahey might have some similar experiences, simply because I think when you're dealing with housing, you're dealing with an asset that people have often, especially in parts of our state, have had some sort of ownership relationship with for generations. And you alluded to it a little earlier, Kate, when you referred to people from away. Maine is certainly the only place that I've ever lived where you can live here for 20 years and people still refer to you as from away. I'm originally from Pittsburgh. I've spent many years in Haverhill and Boston and Newburyport. So I've lived a lot of places in the East Coast, but it's a very strong cultural thing in Maine. And so I think that does manifest itself pretty distinctly across along the coast of Maine, where you have people that are very invested in the way that their town is, and they think it always should be that way. And so that's where some of the resistance can come from. And it can come in the way of, in some cases, seeing people who are theoretically interested in building housing, but they don't want it to be built in their town. And that's the fundamental issue. So that's that is really part of that buy-in process that I referred to, which is getting people's heads around the idea of how do we think about housing in a way that might be different than how we thought of it before. A 3-acre lot with a single house on it in a rural area of town. Is that really what we want to have in the future? And so that might relate to, for a lot of people, especially in our area, the tie-in with climate change and with the dramatic impacts that we're seeing of sea level rise in our coastal towns. If we do not fundamentally take a different approach to building housing, we're not going to be able to address that effectively. And so tying those two things together has been really, really key. The other thing I'll refer to in Maine, two things that I think are very interesting for our state. One is that we have the idea of this concept of local control. And it's not just a concept in Maine. It is enshrined in our Constitution. It means that the individual municipalities have a very strong voice in what passes the legislature. It also means that funding for things is very much mandated to be paid for if we are going to require municipalities to do them. So they can make or break a piece of legislation. They can absolutely jump on board, or they can oppose it and kill it. And so that is a fundamental reality that we're dealing with. And that also then plays out in the last thing I'll mention in Maine, which is the very strong we just have towns and parts of Maine that are very urban and coastal, and we have other parts of Maine, and also along those areas we have parts that are rural. We also have more remote parts of Maine. As you guys all know, Maine is a very big state, and so we have parts of Maine that are very remote, and where people are very invested in doing things the way they like to do things. So we've got to kind of navigate all of those different perspectives in crafting legislation at the state level so that they can then implement it and do it in a way that feels right and feels comfortable for them. So those are two things that I would add just to the main specific nature, that it's not really, I think to the point that, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your name. Oh, sorry. Representative Argus's person, Mallory, sorry. You were saying that where you've got people who just are it's not partisan. It's not really a partisan issue. It's just sort of a very much a way of living, and people feel very, very invested in that. So,
Representative McCarthy-Vahey, what would you say is sort of how this plays out in Connecticut, where you had this massive success last year, and it's sort of been something that we've all been looking to in terms of how you pulled that off. And so I'm curious, sort of who was on board? How did you make that happen? Who was your opposition? And what impact did sort of both of those sort of groups of folks have?
Well, thank you for saying that. I have my dear friend in the legislature for me, because there's no singular first person in the legislature. And before I kind of go into the Connecticut specific, I do think Rep. Geer, I could echo many of the things that you said that were Maine specific. And I wasn't nodding along. In terms of the bill we passed last year, it really was the work of many years prior to my service on the Planning and Development Committee, of a group of folks who have worked in housing reform and advocacy for many years, specifically to reorganize, starting with the reorganization of the zoning enabling statute. That is what enables our municipalities, who also have spoken quite a bit about the importance of having that local say and local control. We had to, in order to pass that bill, those opt-out provisions were two of the things that some folks were very disappointed in, but that was a compromise that we needed to get it across the finish line in terms of accessory dwelling unit and the parties. I think the thing that I do want to say, which doesn't exactly answer your question, but speaks a little bit to the idea of opposition or support. I want to point to, I think it was June 5th, there was an article in the New York Times, and I was just trying to quickly Google it, the twilight of the NIMBY. And I see heads nodding. I thought that was a really well done piece in terms of speaking to the nuance of the conversation. In Connecticut, a lot of the conversation related to affordable housing, and I think this happens many places, though I don't have the experience, is related to race and class. And I think that that does play a role, certainly. I mean, Pete, the group is called Desegregate Connecticut. But I think that in a lot of communities, to Rep. Geer's point, it's really more of a conversation about what kind of community did we move to, do we expect, not in terms of race and class, but more in terms of density and size and scale, which is one of the reasons why I was glad that in our state statute, we changed the word character to physical characteristics, because then we can talk about what it means to have a project we have right now being proposed in the center of our downtown, 60,000, just over 60,000 people. And there's a 6-story building being proposed, and the community is really concerned about it. There are nuances to the conversation. And sometimes when we have these conversations, we get in our corners, we don't listen to each other, and we have difficulty with the nuance. I started my day this morning on a Zoom at 8 a.m. with some folks from an organization called Braver Angels. And I think that that model of the social work model, and the social worker by training, of being able to actively listen, I found that even within our housing advocacy community, there were very strong differences of opinions about how to get where we want to go. And that goes again back to the let's all be clear about what the problem is, how to define it, and then how we might get there, which might be different roads. So I think we certainly have had that in terms of process and expectation. We in Connecticut have had a lot of partisan resistance, which I think is unfortunate. I think, to Rep. Geer's point, the conversation really sometimes depends more on community by community, but we've certainly had a lot of partisan conversation. And even within the Democratic Party, there are plenty of people who are were looking for a lot more in last year's bill, who wouldn't necessarily see it as a win. And then folks on the other side who were looking for less. And that's the struggle. I think these issues are some of the most complex that we face. How do Americans build wealth? We build wealth largely through home ownership. That is, or business ownership, which is largely unavailable to a lot of poor communities and communities of color. So how do we address that issue of wealth building and the generational impact as it relates to housing. How do we address using tools like GIS mapping and some of the visualization tools more effectively to help people see what it means for our communities? And then how do we address the fact that I think we have to be careful about assuming intent from one another and how we listen to each other to then come up with the best possible solutions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Representative McCarthy-Vahey. I mean, when I think about some of the partners that were incredibly supportive of LD 2003 here, it's a very interesting cast of characters, right? The realtors across the state, the Realtor Association, and many individual realtors in our legislature, we have a citizens legislature, were actually very instrumental in building support for the bill. Developers were very important in building support for the bill. Businesses that are really looking for workers were supportive of the bill. And these are not, typical quote unquote Democratic constituencies, if you will. I was also very, very encouraged to see that this is, when you look across the state of Maine, and this might be the case in your states as well. In some of the municipalities of varying sizes, some of the city councils and mayors that are leading the way on this they come from across the political spectrum. There are some of them who absolutely get it, and they are driving their communities forward with, inclusive development, redoing their own zoning. They're way out ahead of this. And you heard a little bit about my background early on. In the business world, when you've got folks that are running ahead and leading the way, you get right behind them and follow the charge, because they are the ones that are removing the obstacles and getting people on board, simply because they're making it happen and people can see it. Back to your point about GIS and visualization, you can see it like, in the town next door, they're doing this and that looks great. So, I think that was a really interesting lesson of our experience over the last 2 years.
Kate, may I add just one other thing? And thank Rick here for those comments. We did have the home builders who were advocating. We had, the people you might expect are the housing advocates. And we have not heard as much from the business community directly, but we're starting to hear more from them in Connecticut because of what's happened with COVID and the fact that it's so much more difficult to address the labor shortages, and for very many reasons. So we're hearing more about that too.
I want to thank Megan in the chat for answering Sarah's question. If everybody else has data around sort of how having affordable housing or lower cost housing nearby impacts higher cost housing's property values, that'd be a welcome resource. Thank you. Thank you both, Sarah, for asking, and Megan for flagging one of the potential sources. Relatedly, actually, to sort of builders and sort of who's been in support and sort of what it's taken to sort of get things across the finish line, that local opposition that Representative Gear was speaking to here in Maine has been really powerful. And because there are so many local officials and they all have a very tight, close relationship in general with their state elected folks, so their state senators and their state representatives, they're an incredibly powerful force at the legislature. And it really seemed to take having the State Chamber of Commerce and some of the other chambers of commerce aligned with the progressives, which is not a typical thing that happens, along with some of the planning folks and some of the the housing folks who are sort of the technical experts. It sort of took that triad of people and faces to really be able to push back on sort of that push for 100% local control, that we're going to decide exactly what happens in our town and you can't tell us anything to do about it, and you've got this wrong. There's no way that anything you want to do is going to work here, and just let us do this on our own. We'll solve the problem. And I think related to what Sarah asked in the chat, it feels like there's a lot of misinformation out there about sort of how do we, what are the impacts? What are the stories that we tell around what does it mean if we actually address our housing crisis? That is it just sort of helping people, or does it actually benefit all of us? And you've got all the folks who are sort of standing on the side of we need more housing, saying, no, we're all really suffering. Everybody is suffering from not having enough housing. And then you've got other folks saying, it's really good. Like, we really don't want to mess up some of these good things. And we can do this in small ways. And it's not really this big giant thing. And so it's interesting sort of seeing what data is available and the stories that we tell that seem to be so different about sort of how this crisis is playing out and how we address it. I'm curious which of those sort of stories you found your governors sort of using, talking about housing. What roles did your governors play in sort of in making some of this happen, or preventing some of it from happening, or sort of negotiating or brokering deals? Was this really sort of, what story were they telling about housing, and what impact did that have? And I'll start with Mallory. What did Governor Baker do?
So, yeah, the Baker administration, Governor Baker, currently they're creating the guidelines for the implementation of the MBTA communities bill. So they've released the draft guidelines and they're still working on finalizing them. But they've done a great job at creating guidelines that really capture the intention of the bill and advance the bill's just positive intent. And Governor Baker also introduced the housing choice bill. And while his housing choice bill didn't include the MBTA communities provision, the fact that he pushed so hard for a housing bill in the first place did facilitate a vehicle for Rep. Vargas's bill.
That's really exciting. Representative McCarthy-Vahey, what was the governor's relationship to all of this in Connecticut, or what is their relationship?
So in Connecticut, this has really been a grassroots effort from folks for many years. And I think where we've seen support in housing from the governor is really to provide some additional funding, which is very exciting. We had $50 million added to this year's budget to be able to develop affordable housing. And we hope to see more funding through the bonding process that we hope will continue. You know, as I mentioned, our committees are a little bit separate. So our housing committee is separate from the planning and development. And we, you know, really this was largely a legislative push. I think we haven't had as much direct conversation in that way. Certainly the governor was supportive and signed the legislation. And I think the governor very much recognizes that this is an area that is impacting our residents and our economy, and I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to continue to do more work together in the future.
How would you characterize Governor Mills?
Governor Mills, I think, and this is my point of view on it, early on, I don't think had too much of a focus on housing, but that her focus has increased on housing as it's become more and more of an inhibitor in our economic development specifically. So I'm very, I believe Governor Mills they put together a very strong strategic plan for the growth of the Maine economy. And one of the key obstacles that really has emerged is the housing. And we have companies in Maine who are building apartment buildings for their employees because they simply cannot find any place for them to live. And we've got people who have gotten hired and come to start the new job and haven't been able to find housing and have left the state. So I think it's just become, it's a matter of necessity at this point. I guess Representative McCarthy-Vahey, 50 million sounds like the magic number because that's how much our governor has put toward housing as well. So funding is also key. And then also I think it was a very important symbolic action that she took to elevate a post in her administration from basically put it in the job someone who had spent many, many years working in building affordable housing in the state. So I think he's bringing a nuanced level of understanding of things at the state level, at the administration level. So that's helping as well.
Yeah. Well, that Representative Guerra is an excellent segue to what we were going to talk about next, which sort of what is the role of the private sector that the private sector plays a huge role in the housing market overall. And so Representative McCarthy-Vahey, can you talk to us a little bit about sort of what you see as being a healthy and positive role for the private sector to play in addressing the housing crisis?
Well, when we talk about housing, we have to talk about funding. And what I've learned over the years is that I don't, nor do I think most of us know enough about how housing funding works, because it's pretty complicated. And the need to layer and stack and fill in makes it tough. And so there are 3 ways to pay for housing, and feel free, any of you who are experts, to correct me. But it's fully public sector money and tax credits, it's fully private sector money, or it's some combination of both. And as far as I can tell, those are the 3 choices. And so when you look at the tremendous cost that it is to develop housing and build housing, which is what we need to do in so many places, build housing, especially now with the materials issues and labor issues, the cost has gone up. And $50 million is tremendous, but it's a drop in the bucket next to what we need, not just to build, but also to rehabilitate and preserve the places that are a little older and need some love. So I think that it's going forward, we're going to have to continue to partner with the private sector. Here in Connecticut, we've struggled in some communities with that issue, with people, being frustrated with some of the ability of the private sector to take certain steps in terms of building. And what we talk about often is being able to partner proactively with developers, to have communities really be proactive in their planning, like our community did years ago when we had a new train station built and created an overlay zone to help, really incentivize more affordable housing, to look at density in that particular area. But there's no way to do this work without the private sector. So there have to be willing partners out there. And certainly, we've got the nonprofit world, but the for-profit world, they bring funding. I think it's really tricky. I'm just going to reference, I was at a Boy Scout meeting this past week, and boy, these kids were sharp. One of the students, one of the scouts, asked me what I was going to do about these private equity firms who are coming in and purchasing as investment, and how are we going to address that? And I said, wow, that's impressive. That's a real issue. That's a real issue in a place like Fairfield County, Connecticut, for example. And I didn't have a great answer for him at the moment, but we are going to have to partner with the private sector, but we're going to have to look at some of those issues that, could put some of that really good, positive, sustainable, smart development at risk.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's the subject for our September gathering when we reconvene across the states, is what do we do about corporate control of housing and housing as an investment versus housing for places to live. We're certainly having that conversation here in Maine as we have out-of-state corporate conglomerates purchasing housing and jacking up rents. Mallory, along those lines, could you speak to sort of what the role of the private sector is in all of this development that's going to be coming as a result of the legislation that was passed, and how Massachusetts is thinking about sort of making sure that public funding is really spent in a way that that the public is really proud of and they feel like they're getting their money's worth as they partner with businesses and developers?
Yeah, so I want to echo Representative McCarthy-Vahey's points, and also add that as developers are working closely with legislators and city officials and building relationships within the municipalities that they're going to be developing housing in, also keeping in mind the needs of the community and proposing projects that offer senior housing and affordable housing and the needs that communities have. And I also think that the private sector extends beyond just developers. I think that kind of all private sector businesses in communities can play a role in encouraging housing to come to their communities. You can work on campaigns to spread the word about the need for more workforce housing, more affordable housing. It can join coalitions like this that are advocating for pro-housing legislation. And I think the representatives have touched on points about why maybe smaller businesses would want to be involved. Where are workers going to live if there's no housing? Parents that have homes, where are kids going to live when they grow up if there's no housing available? So making sure that we're all having these conversations and meeting people where they're at and involving the private sector in the kind of pro-housing movement and conversations. And I'll also add, right now, I think there's a lot of discomfort about housing coming to communities in certain places, not everywhere. And not everyone feels that way. But when a small business opens up in a community, if there's an ice cream shop or a new restaurant that opens up, it's usually kind of exciting. People are excited about it. There's a ribbon cutting. There's kind of positive associations with this. But in certain circumstances, if a housing development comes up, depending on how people in the community feel about it, there's typically more discomfort by comparison. And housing is a positive thing. Having places for people to live is a positive thing. And kind of changing those conversations and reframing housing and new housing and changing the way that we think about housing, I think is important for kind of reframing this as a positive thing.
I love that. I love that. Representative Gear, is there anything you wanted to add to your earlier comments about sort of the role of business and the private sector?
Yeah, because I think that it kind of, we've touched a little bit about where we see things going in the future. And from my perspective, we are facing this fundamental challenge where we've got a few developers who can do this complicated work well. And in Maine, and we see them across the state in different projects. They have a stock in trade. They really understand how to work the complexity of the LIHTC proposals and all of the complicated paperwork you need to get through, including all the ongoing monitoring that's necessary. But we don't have enough of them. So I think one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about these last few months is how do we leverage what people can do now and enable more people to do that work. So does that involve partnerships with those private sector companies and or with the other kinds of developers who might be coming up? So in our state, we have some housing trusts that are nonprofits that are building different kinds of homes for ownership in different parts of the state that are typically high cost. Can we bring these folks together with the knowledge that they have to make that process more doable so that it can happen more and we can build more housing? So that's something that I think is going to be really important moving forward. I'm big on the maxim, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you always got. So if we just keep doing the same thing, it's not going to change a lot. The other issue does have to do with zoning that I'll mention. And that is, I've talked to a lot of developers in our area, small developers who maybe are these days spending a lot of time building very expensive homes on the coast for different people, but have tried to do maybe a senior housing development or a more affordable housing development, multi-family, multi-unit kind of place in different communities in our area. And typically what's happened is they maybe have spent 10 months working the process, spending days and days with the zoning board and the volunteers on that board, trying to deal with, 100 years of regulations that have never been rationalized. So a big part of it does, for me, get back to the zoning and land use question, because a challenge that we can help communities deal with is how do you make better sense of your zoning so that it can be at least more sensible to navigate. I think that's the frustrating thing, because a lot of those developers, they just throw in the towel. They say, we cannot spend any more time, which is money, on this effort, even though we are community members and we want to do the right thing. We can't do it anymore. So getting over those hurdles where people who are really well-intentioned can actually get through the processes in their own communities. And so those are the two things that I think can help really just put into action more of the great local folks have to do the development work.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that there's a lot of
have
folks who
one-
have questions. I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask their questions too. So, okay, Representative McCarthy, go ahead and add your comment, but I want to make sure we also get a chance to open it up broadly. And
I appreciate that. That's so fair. I want to just comment on what Mallory said about we are excited about businesses, and to build on what Rep. Gear said about zoning. You know, zoning is in large part about creating expectations for people. So when you create a zone, people understand or know. And I think that's where some of the struggle, certainly we've seen that in Connecticut, is, you know, if we have a zone that people know and expect that a business is coming into, or know and expect a certain type of housing. And that's certainly what a lot of the work that Desegregate has focused on, is showing us with the zoning atlas, you know, what people's expectations are based on the way the zones are drawn. So zoning is one of those really wonky things. I often say government, it's like an iceberg. What you see at the top is just a little bit, but what's underneath all of this is definitely zoning.
yeah, absolutely.
Make friends with your planners. They know how to get it done, right?
Well, I would like to pass it over to Cassie, who is going to make sure that as many of the questions from the audience here get to be answered as possible this evening. But thank you all so much for sharing sort of the stories of what's happened and the things that feel like it's sort of happening next, and where you want this to go in terms of the next steps in each of your states. And so appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. You did an amazing job. If everyone can give Kate either an air applause or an emoji applause, whichever one is more accessible to you. So that was amazing. And thank you to our panelists. I'm excited to help facilitate any of the questions from our audience. We just have a few in right now. And so if anything comes up for you, please feel free to drop it in the chat and I'll make sure to get to it. And I know there have been a few questions that we've touched on already, but I want to make sure we revisit them. And one of the first questions that was submitted was from Sarah Bromley, really exploring this question, which I've, in my advocacy work, have heard before as well, which is, you know, her example is from Milford, Connecticut, speaking with folks there who say they're worried that lower cost housing near them will negatively affect their property value. And sort of reflecting that from Sarah's research, that doesn't seem to be true empirically with the data. And so I'm wondering if our panelists can touch on what about from sort of your experience or any research that you might have stumbled upon helps to either dispel that myth or can sort of speak to that question of that concern of property value. And I'll just allow anyone who has an answer to just jump right in.
Yeah, you're catching me on something I don't remember details on in terms of that particular fact and whether there is research to prove that. But I do think that, you know, the way I always turn it around in our area, you know, many of you are from New England, right? You're all from New England, you come up to Maine, and there's nothing worse than going out to your favorite restaurant and not being able to get service because they don't have enough workers. So, you know, I think that idea of turning the need on its head for someone who just wants to, this is what they're used to, they have a certain expectation of living in our community. All of that is not possible if we do not have, again, back to my regular people housing, places for regular people who make a community what it is, right? Who are the people who enrich our lives every day. They do the work in our schools, in our towns, etc. And if they're not here, this isn't a real community. So I have that conversation a lot with everybody. For me, that also really means that our communities grow in capability and diversity. And I do feel that, you know, slowly but surely that shift is really happening, certainly in our part of Maine, I think generally in the world. So that's a wonderful thing. But I found that kind of argument, which is if you're going to want to have a real community, you're going to have to figure out a way to have places for people to live, period. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Mallory or Representative McCarthy-Vahey. Any comments there before we move on to the next question?
Yes, I would say, I'm probably not the right person to ask this question of because I don't have the research at my fingertips. But I do think it gets at that very important issue is what are people's fears and concerns related to the development of housing, whether it's affordable housing or deeply affordable or, more moderate income. I think that's part of what we get at and what I was talking about earlier, which is the protection of that asset. And that article that I saw that Pete put in the chat really talks about NIMBY is almost an insurance policy, right? You're not wanting to, if you invest in the stock market, you're not looking for the assets to go down when it's time for you to cash out and pay for a child's college education or to retire. And people feel the same about their housing that they've certainly spent sometimes a generation investing in. I think this is a really, really, really important point. And I would say it's probably important that people like me and Rep. Gear have that data at our fingertips. I would also say that I've certainly seen some affordable housing, as all of you have, that's much better than others, right? And that's true for all kinds of housing that can enhance, and it goes again, not just to how the impact on an individual owner, homeowner, or business owner, but to the community and what that means from a sustainability standpoint.
Yeah, I'm chuckling, not at you, but hopefully with you, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, because it's always fascinating. Housing is one of those things like branding and logos where people have such strong personal opinions. So we'll have a certain development, it looks very New England-y, and people say, oh, I love that. It's so traditional looking and it's affordable and isn't that wonderful? And there's something else that's more modern. Oh, I hate that. It's such a personal thing. So I think it's hilarious sometimes when you look at the personal viewpoints that go into evaluating something like that. And to me, everybody's got different tastes. So if you start to think about, how things look and feel so much, being able to get out of that mode by setting, having, I think the form-based housing, that's a really good tool to say we don't want everything to look exactly the same, but here are some general shapes. Then you can customize that as you want. But, it's one of those things that unless you get out of that conversation, it is a dead end because people will, they'll die on that hill. They like a certain style of housing. They don't like this other style. Well, everybody's different. So I'm not going to start dictating that.
And I don't mean to go on and on, but that goes back to what I said about setting expectations. And that's why that tool is another great tool to be able to provide to communities so that people can have some understanding and have some expectations.
Yep.
I read this great article in Vox about how we have to, like in New England, we have to stop fetishizing this like old colonial home because it's not sustainable and it's like crumbling infrastructure, it's sort of contributing to that. I don't know, Mallory, did you want to say something? Was it along those same lines?
Yeah, I was just about to mention there's a great Vox video. It's called In Defense of the Gentrification Building. And they talk about the concerns that people have about these new buildings. But one thing they talk about in this video is that a century ago, the New York brownstones were actually considered to be really ugly, modern buildings that nobody liked because they didn't reflect the character of the city, which was these more wooden buildings. So tastes change over time and people's tastes are different. And yeah, I think it's also important to return to the point about property values. The evidence that I've seen has demonstrated that property values don't necessarily go down when new housing is added to communities. And I think it's just important to note that there are places, at least in Massachusetts, where home values have skyrocketed and there's been a lot of new housing developed. Haverhill is one of the places where home prices has gone up a lot and there's been a lot of new housing. And it's important to note that it's different for different communities. Housing affects communities differently. So new housing is not going to impact one home the same way everywhere. That would be my addition.
Thank you so much, Mallory. And I want to just uplift this second part of the question that I wanted to make sure I didn't miss from Sarah's question, with this sort of like idea that can perhaps be called a myth because of the data and research around it, about production sort of negatively affecting property value, specifically of lower cost affordable housing. From the role of an advocate who maybe is low capacity or a volunteer sort of activist, is it more helpful to spend time really educating the general public about this issue, or like dispelling this myth? Or is it more helpful to maybe focus on town planning and zoning members, officials, and legislators? Any sort of comments or ideas around that?
I'm just gonna say both and. It's gotta be both and. I mean, it has to be, especially in the social media age, and especially in places where you've got, you know, really engaged community members, which I'm very fortunate to have here in my community. But we did, I saw there's another question down, 6107, that's part of what we did, was to institute planning requirements. And as you said, Rep. Gear, get to know your planners. Those planners are phenomenal. And a lot of people have no idea what a planner is or what a planner does, but they're the people who are helping us to create our future. And I think absolutely those citizen volunteers who are either appointed or oftentimes elected may come in with no body of knowledge. And I can tell you, as planning and development chair, I came in with my local experience as a local elected, and as someone who's been interested in working on walkable communities, but I'm not a zoning expert, right? You have to know where to go for the information, who you can rely on, and start to build up that base of knowledge.
Yeah, they're the ones that see day to day how the zoning that you've had has resulted in what it has resulted in. And so they know where you can tweak, where you can change to change the behavior that results. And that is, for me, and I will say this sitting here as a white woman living in coastal Maine, that is something that it is, for me, getting to the result, which is a community that does not have those obstacles in place so that all people can live what they want. That is the outcome that I'm looking for. And I think sometimes, and I'm on the Labor and Housing Committee in Maine, we spent hours this year talking in our committee with historic expertise from the University of Maine, folks who came in and educated us on how this stuff happened in Maine. Hugely important knowledge. Everybody in the state should have that knowledge. And more important for me as a legislator right now is, how do we dismantle it? Fine, we know it, it's done. I know it, and I'm in a role and I'm in power and I am in the job that I can do something about it. How do we fix it? And that is where my focus is. So I do think both of those things, Cassie, to your question, are important. I think for me, my priority right now is, how do we make the changes to make it different in the future?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I just want to uplift a comment that was made in the chat by Jen Carty, that, you know, it's not just property values, but increased housing at all price points improves and broadens the tax base and can therefore create more resources for city, towns, and services. So really related to answering that question or contextualizing it. Thank you for adding that, Jen. I want to move us along just to make sure we're answering as many questions as we can. And this next question is really asking, you know, given the cost of building materials, realizing those may not go down anytime soon, are there any realistic alternatives to typical construction? And this person, you know, for example, read about huge 3D printers that can produce low-cost housing. Wow, that's my own anecdote. Wow. Any sort of thoughts or answers to that?
I'll put in my plug for Maine. We've got a lot going on in our state with our timber industry and our forest products industry, and looking at a lot of the new cross-laminated timber products that can be used to build buildings that are 6-7 stories tall that are stronger than steel buildings. It's a great way to use a resource that we have in abundance here in Maine. It is local, so the transportation costs and resulting impacts on climate change would be ameliorated. And it's, also, I think, very attractive in terms of how the buildings look. So I think that is one of the materials that we are definitely looking at more in our state that might be relevant for the rest of New England.
Yeah, I've never heard about that. That's amazing. Thank you, Representative Gear. Anything from Connecticut, Representative McCarthy-Vahey?
So I don't have an answer to specific building styles or materials, but I do want to just comment about cost of building. When we think about costs, there's the initial construction cost, and then there's a long-term cost to the people who live there. So I think about that too in terms of, it's the same way I feel about electric vehicles. You may pay a little bit more upfront, but over time, the cost is going to equal out and potentially be even more. So I think that's also something that we have to think about when we're thinking about what we build. But I have seen a few different alternatives, but I don't know, they're more kind of single family, 1 story, 2 story. What you talked about, Rep Gear, is really interesting to me because you're talking about what are some of the alternatives for some of those multifamily developments.
Yeah, it's an interesting application. And the other thing I will add, and this is a place where we did invest as the legislature in a bill that is specifically designed, I guess using it as a test case is probably too strong a term, but really requiring projects that are largely funded by the state for affordable housing to use and to build to standards that allow for well-sealed buildings, energy efficiency, and again, climate change, addressing the issues of climate change in the building process, so that the developers that apply for those projects need to have those standards in place. So that's another thing that it's a bit of a challenge because it does increase the costs, but long-term cost of ownership, to your point, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, that long-term cost of ownership, if you're spending a lot less on energy because it's not all going out all of the loose windows, as much of it does in our buildings today, that's a good thing. And I think we'll create a more affordable place for the ownership of the building, and then also for the residents, because they keep the rents down.
Thank you so much, representatives. Mallory, anything from the Massachusetts end with like creative or alternatives to construction or to typical construction?
So I don't have the answer to the question about direct materials, but one thing I just wanted to add was labor. And I think it's important to create incentives and encourage people to enter trades that are critical to building housing, because there's also a shortage of people that are actually able to build the housing, and it's really complicated to build. So that's one thing that I would add as something that needs to be thought about.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, I want to also just uplift a few comments that were made in the chat, both for folks that might not have access to the chat and also for anyone listening to this recording afterwards, before we move on to our final 2 questions. One comment is from Jason DeRozier, who says zoning was designed as a tool to inherently separate uses and people, leading to segregation and disinvestment. It was purposefully done. Absolutely. Thank you, Jason, for just regrounding us in that truth. And then let's see, I think there was just one more. Oh, okay. I think the next one is really a question on this person, Palinda, would love to hear more about the trainings and certification for zoning commission. What have been challenges, opposition, and what are the elements that have been successful?
I can start with that one. I think challenges is no local community likes to be told that they need to do something, and Rep Gear referenced the unfunded mandate conversation that often happens. So in Connecticut, with passing that legislation, we worked largely and very closely with our Connecticut Conference of Municipalities and our organizations of small towns. And they are going to work together with some other groups to help create and provide those training opportunities. We had to talk a little bit about what we might want to see covered, because we didn't want to just say, oh, do training and then have a training be, really not important. I mean, Rep. Kira, to your point, and to Jason's, I think it was Jason, right? Am I saying the right name? We have to understand the background and the history and what it is we need to do to, again, go back to that. What are the results we're looking for? So I think that was really required a lot of negotiating, compromising. And I was thrilled that we were able to pass that here in Connecticut to assure that at least, again, there's some kind of shared body of knowledge among the commissioners who are making these decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it ended up being the training and the state grant program is the mechanism that we used for that, and it's really all about that first B, buy-in, right? So if the municipalities can access the grant program and the materials to update their zoning and land use codes, then they feel like they have a resource to go to. It also helps us not to have to reinvent the wheel. Every community doesn't need to do all of this on their own. You can leverage what you can access from the state and what you can learn from each other. And then as a state, we increase that body of knowledge. So.
Great, thank you so much. Mallory, anything to add just on zoning commissions, training, certification, or general comments about how we can be maybe more supportive from like the constituent or advocacy viewpoint?
Yeah, I think just increasing people's local involvement in what's going on in their local communities. I think there are so many different things to track and there are so many different things to follow, but I think particularly in Massachusetts, just encouraging people at the local level to really closely follow what's happening in their municipalities is key.
That feels really relevant to Sarah's comment in the chat around, many of the planning and zoning members in her town are volunteer, and they mostly just get yelled at by residents. So what would it look like to have more of like a more positive relationship with constituents in the area, and really being the lead on that as advocates. So thank you. We're going into our final two questions here. Just would like to know, how much do various stakeholders get the connection between things like transit-oriented communities, smaller lots, and reducing climate change? How much does climate change influence our conversations on housing and density? I don't know. Oh, sorry, I feel bad. I keep going to Mallory last. I don't know if she wants to go first, but it's okay. Okay, go ahead, Representative.
Representative, you go ahead. You're about to start.
The point I was going to make was that I am often surprised how little people connect those, and it's, to me, it's one of those things that is on its face fundamental to addressing climate change and to making our lives more livable. I mean, in Maine now, you might have a job here in Kennebunkport, and you might have to drive an hour each way in order to get to a house that you can afford, a place that you can afford to live. It's not sustainable. People can't do this forever. And I think that that is another thing. That's a big selling point to trying how to work through these. It's the climate change and it's the transportation issue, because people get frustrated at some point with it.
Absolutely. I think as like advocates in building our narrative, we have to make clear those connections amongst different industries, whether it's education, business, climate, you name it. Mallory, would you like to add anything? Just the conversation around climate change, housing, and density?
Yeah, they're very interconnected. And at least from kind of a personal perspective, I live in Boston. I live about 3.5 miles away from the State House. And if I drive to the State House, it takes me like 35 minutes. And that is crazy. And it's because of density, it's because of congestion. And when there isn't enough housing close to transit stops, and there aren't enough transit stops for people to feel like public transit is the most reliable way for them to get themselves to where they need to be, that has a massive impact on climate because there's more cars on the road, there's more congestion. So the two things are completely interconnected, and I think we need to continue the messaging around that.
Thank you so much. And what about in Connecticut?
Well, I really appreciate this question. Two things. One, some of the strongest opposition has been saying that building multifamily dense housing is bad for the environment. That's what we are addressing, when in fact we know that sprawl is actually what puts us at risk on a lot of levels. So I think that's a real challenge, because in today's age, you know, that the narratives that are out there can be based on things that are, you know, misinformation. On the other hand, we live in a coastal community, and Rep. Gear, you're a coastal community also. We've had a lot of flooding, both inland flooding and coastal flooding with Sandy and Irene. We've seen and felt the impacts of what climate change is doing and going to do. And for a lot of folks, their sense is that, oh, the overdevelopment is what's making these things worse. When I've heard clearly at times from our town engineers, for example, with some of our inland flooding, where we've buried the river years ago, and where some of the, you know, the older development is actually having the bigger impact. But I think that's something that we have to contend with, is the public's understanding and perception of what development does, or what density impacts are. I do think it means we need to make sure that we're properly addressing that infrastructure. Back to my iceberg model. That's why one of the working groups that we passed in last year's bill is to talk about sewers and septic and how we're addressing those issues. But I absolutely think there's a connection, and you know, for some of the coastal or those communities along rivers, those Maine waterways, not Maine, your state, but the Maine waterways, we've got to pay attention to that too.
I love a good Maine pun.
No.
Best. And I that really, what you were saying, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, really speaks to, I think, some of our issues in like Cape Cod as well, right? Like these issues are so interconnected, and we're, you know, we can really collaborate to try to think about some solutions because it's happening across the region. Great, well, I appreciate each of you so much. And I know our audience does. We have one last question before we close for the evening with Pete from Desegregate Connecticut. And this question is from Chris. Has there been any interest in removing density caps or caps on building sizes stay the same in urban or transit-oriented development areas?
I will start here. I feel like that's more of a Massachusetts aimed question. To be honest, I'm not sure, but I can put my email in the chat and find out.
I love that. Thank you so much, Mallory. I appreciate that. Okay, well, I guess unless Representative Gear, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, if you have anything to add around density caps.
So, Rep. Gear, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll follow you.
No, Cassie, just to make sure that I didn't miss the question, it was for going forward, what expectations are, right?
Is there any appetite for that? So removing density caps in urban areas.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, one of the things that we found in the conversation in the past, you know, 3 to 4 years here in Connecticut is we probably have to do more work in terms of the buy-in piece that Rep. Gear started with. And we need to, and I think, you know, Desegregate and many other groups, you know, we have the Partnership for Strong Communities. There is a lot of that. But because of the kind of resistance we've faced in some of the conversations that have happened, I think we're going to have to circle back and really work hard on what things mean for communities and help people see the benefits for their communities and their residents.
Yep, that's an excellent point. And I guess the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, the two things that we felt like were achievements in 2003, one is the increased density bonus for the growth area. So that's where communities have already really established an area as the growth area that they're investing in. So they have water and sewer there. They have in some cases in their comprehensive planning, they have designated as such. That seemed like a logical step for those folks. And then the other thing was, this was huge for us. In a single family zoned lot now, you can build up to a duplex. And I think we struck a good balance there between being able to not incentivize sprawl, but to allow greater density on those, bigger properties that are perhaps more out in the rural areas of our town. So I think that was good. And then I think the nitty gritty of the density question is probably more urban in nature than what I'm typically dealing with, but yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Representative Gear, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, Mallory. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I've learned so much. I know you've been chatting for quite a while, a little bit over an hour. So I am going to close this Q&A section and hand things over to Chris. I'm sorry, not Chris, Pete. I was reading the last Q&A's name. Pete, to close this out for tonight.
Thanks so much, Cassie. And yes, thanks again, everybody on our panel. This was a really informative conversation. I think we learned a lot of similarities and some insights into our differences that hopefully, everybody can go back to their prospective states and keep building on the success that we've all had here. We want to keep doing events like this. And if anyone's wondering, we don't want to leave out Vermont, Rhode Island, or New Hampshire. Vermont had a great minimum lot size reform passed recently. Rhode Island's doing some cool stuff on social housing. And New Hampshire has a couple of pro-homes groups kind of bubbling up in the Manchester area. So our hope is really starting this conversation across the region and how we can create more homes and more diversity of homes. We'll start with these kinds of conversations and trading ideas, learning from each other, having great champions in the legislature and on staffs, making sure that these changes get through to the public, get through to local stakeholders. So thank you so much for that. I just want to turn it over quickly to Cassie and Kate. We're just going to do kind of a roundup for some events coming up. Just for us, for Desegregate Connecticut, we have a Pro Homes, Pro Pizza Hang, our annual in-person hangout. That's going to happen on Sunday at noon in New Haven in Worcester Square Park, 0.8 miles from the Union Station. We really hope folks in Connecticut, or if anyone from New England wants to come down, got some great New Haven style pizza, please come to that. We also have one of our series of transit-oriented community walk audits coming up at Bethel, which is on the Danbury line. That's Thursday, June 30th. And we encourage folks to sign up for those through our newsletter to stay informed about other events that we've got coming up and other things that we're trying to work on together. So I'll turn it over to Cassie for any updates coming up on your end.
Thanks so much, Pete. So we just have a few actions happening that we invite our New England sort of friends and family to sign on to. We are nearing the end of our legislative session and are still petitioning our members to sign on in support of HB 1448, which is the production bill that I spoke to a little bit earlier in our remarks. We just hit our goal of 400 signatures, but of course we want to get more than that. So please sign on to that, and I'd be happy to put that in the chat. Our next event is coming up in the fall. It's going to be right after the final guidelines are released from DHCD around the MBTA communities law. We're going to be hosting like an on-the-ground organizer training for really how to move forward in implementing this within our communities and planning some advocacy strategy. That's happening on September 8th.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. And over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so MPA has a couple of upcoming events. The one that is most related to housing is there's a National Renters Rising call that's happening from 7:30 to 9 o'clock on next Tuesday, the 26th. I think that's Tuesday. And so that's a chance for folks who want to find out more about how tenants can work together to on everything from sort of issues with landlords and how to address them, to working on building tenants unions, as well as fighting for things like making sure that they're allowed to have an air conditioner. So lots and lots that are happening, and that's a national Renters Rising call.
All right, well, again, thank you to our panel. Thank you to everyone from Abundant Housing Massachusetts and MPA for just putting this great event together. We look forward to doing these again. Thanks everybody for attending. We'll have this recording up on the website so you can share with other friends and family and members of other groups that haven't been able to come tonight. So thank you so much. And we look forward to staying in touch and working together with all of you in the near future. Have a good night.
Thank you,
Thanks
Pete.
for
Thank you
having us.
so much.
Bye, thanks.